Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second No Workplace Cancer Education webinar. I am Matt Gavorko from Cancer Council WA, where I am responsible for coordinating Cancer Council's National Occupational and Environmental Cancer Prevention Project called No Workplace Cancer. And through this project, we aim to reduce the incidence of cancer caused by exposure to cancer-causing agents in the workplace and the broader environment, and also to communicate the importance of reducing exposure through evidence-based control measures. One of our priority occupational carcinogens is welding, which is the focus of today's webinar. Weld wisely, know the risks, control the exposures. Before we begin, in the spirit of deepening relationships, I'd like to acknowledge all the traditional custodians and owners of country throughout Australia. For the lands that I'm presenting from today, that is the Whadjuk people from the Noongar Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We also pay our respect to their elders and extend that respect to all Aboriginal peoples living and working in this area. So here is the outline of today's webinar. During this webinar, we encourage you to ask any questions you may have. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen, as the chat function is disabled. If the question is seeking clarification about a particular point that's being talked about, then we'll try our best to address it during the presentation. Otherwise, we should have about 15 to 20 minutes to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Additionally, we would appreciate your feedback after the webinar. An online evaluation survey will be sent out, and we encourage you to complete it so that we can improve our future webinars and make it as useful as possible for you all. So with that, it is now my privilege to introduce you to today's guest speaker, Professor Tim Driscoll. Tim is an occupational epidemiologist and a specialist in occupational and environmental medicine and public health medicine. He's a professor in the Sydney School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, and his main areas of interest include the burden of occupational disease and injury, occupational cancer and exposure to occupational carcinogens, occupational lung disease, and then improving the communication of epidemiological principles and findings to the general public. Tim is currently the chair and a long-standing expert member of Cancer Council Australia's Occupational and Environmental Cancer Committee. Over the past 5.5 years, I've had the real privilege of working closely with Tim, who has generously shared his time and expertise and has joined me in commiserating over the success, or should I say lack of success, of our respective footy clubs, the Bombers and the West Coast Eagles. And with that, over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you very much for joining us today. You might have noticed in that photo of Matt and I that I've got the same shirt on today as I had in that photo, and this shirt may or may not appear again in my presentation. So let me share my screen. Okay, you can see that all right, Matt?
All good.
Okay. So, as I said, thanks very much for joining today. I'm planning to talk for maybe 25, 30 minutes. That's the plan. I'll try not to go over that. Matt has already done the acknowledgement of country. I'll just point out I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney. Want to declare I don't have any major conflict of interest, I think. Although I don't have anything, I think, that really conflicts with this, but I have done a small number of medico-legal cases related to welding fume and written a couple of reports for government agencies on this topic. This is what I'm planning to cover today. This I won't go through each one, but I'm planning to cover all of those. Now, just in case you want to switch off at some stage during the presentation, I thought I'd give you my key points first, and I will come back to them again at the end, but at least you'll know what's coming. So in terms of what are the exposures of concern, well, welding fume and UV radiation from a cancer point of view, and I'll be covering both, but focusing on welding fume. In terms of does welding cause cancer? It definitely does. Welding fume causes lung cancer, and the UV radiation causes melanoma of the eye. Who is exposed? Welders with the obvious group, but there are also often people who are working in and around the area where welding is being done who can also be exposed. In terms of exposure control, I'll present some information to you that I think strongly suggests that there's a lot of room for improvement in the controls. In terms of exposure and risk, just in general, not specifically for welding, but including welding, it's worthwhile keeping in mind that the higher the exposure, the higher the risk, which is a problem, but it has the good side of it, that the lower the exposure, the lower the risk. And in terms of prevention and control, that the hierarchy of control is what you should use to guide what you do. Okay, little bit of background. There are a lot of people in Australia who are exposed to welding fume or potentially exposed to welding fume. It's a little hard to know the exact numbers, but when we last looked, there's at least 60,000 people in Australia employed as welders. And there are a lot of other workers who do welding occasionally or who work in the area around where welding's being done. And there's a particular issue, in my mind, a particular issue that we don't really know what the levels of exposure to workers are and how good the use of the control measures are. And I'll show you some information from a study I and several others have been involved in trying to provide information in these areas. So in terms of the exposures of concern, well, I presume most of you know this. I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but just to remind us that, what is welding? It's where you've got high heat being used to melt metals and to join metals. And that process produces fume and it produces high intensity ultraviolet radiation. And also worthwhile remembering, well, what is fume? And it's actually a mixture of metal vapors, metal particulates, and gases, all of which can be a problem. The vapors and the particulate in terms of carcinogenesis, it appears. Well, I mean, definitely, but gases probably not as much. In terms of, well, does welding cause cancer? Stepping away from cancer for a moment, thinking of just the health effects of welding, there are short-term effects which are pretty well known. So metal fume fever, so that's a problem with inflammation in the lungs, and flash burns of the eyes. And they're the ones that people particularly think about. But the long-term effects are probably a bigger problem. It's a little bit of controversy as to whether welding causes chronic lung disease, and I'm not planning to cover that today because the focus today is cancer, but it's worthwhile keeping that in mind. But there's no controversy at all. Welding definitely increases the risk of lung cancer. Welding fume exposure definitely does. And the ultraviolet light definitely increases the risk of ocular melanoma, so that's melanoma of the eye. So yes, welding definitely increases the risk of cancer. And just to show you the evidence about this, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a World Health Organization agency, it's the prominent or preeminent international agency that looks at exposures, not just occupational exposures, all sorts of exposures, to provide guidance as to the level of evidence as to whether those exposures increase the risk of cancer or not. And in 2017, IARC classified welding and the UV exposure from welding as carcinogenic to humans. That means definitely causes cancer. And IARC grades the evidence into different groups, or puts the exposures as a result of that evidence into different groups. Group 1's the highest, meaning definitely causes cancer. In terms of what they said in their reports, that they produced these big monographs, multi-hundred-page tomes that summarize the evidence. And what they said at the end of this is there's sufficient evidence in humans for the carcinogenicity of welding fumes. Welding fumes cause cancer of the lung. There was also a suggestion that it causes cancer of the kidney, but the level of evidence was not as strong as for lung, and not strong enough to say the two were definitely connected. They also said there's sufficient evidence in humans for the carcinogenicity of ultraviolet radiation from welding, and that causes ocular melanoma. So if you want to go and have a look at the evidence, the monograph is the place to go to, but the evidence is clear.
Hey, Tim, just on that point, if you don't mind, we just had a question come through which fits in perfectly with the IARC monograph. But what about UV causing skin cancer on exposed skin?
Yes. So that's been looked at, but the level of evidence is not there. So at the moment, yeah, you couldn't say that the UV from welding causes skin cancer. I think it would be prudent to be covered up. But yeah, as I said, the level of evidence is not there. Doesn't
Excellent.
mean
Thanks,
it
Tim.
doesn't, but you couldn't say that it does. Okay, in terms of looking at levels of evidence, and just worthwhile going over what IARC does, I said it classified the level of evidence into different grades. So for group one, exposures classified as group one definitely cause cancer in humans. Group 2A probably cause cancer in humans. So this would be a situation where there's typically good evidence in animals that the exposure can cause cancer. And there's some evidence in humans, some epidemiological evidence, but not enough to be sure because of problems with selection bias or measurement bias or confounding that means that we can't be entirely confident that there is a connection, but that there's certainly a suggestion of it. Group 2B is where it possibly causes cancer in humans, and this is usually where there's pretty good evidence in animals, but not really evidence in humans. Or it might be there's some evidence in animals and some evidence in humans, but not enough to be confident. Group 3 is where there's just not enough evidence to decide. So just to reinforce, welding, fume, and lung cancer is in group 1. UV radiation from welding and melanoma of the eye is in group 1. Just for your interest, here are some other exposures you've probably heard about that are also group 1 carcinogens. Might be a little bit surprised about alcohol because a lot of people haven't heard of that, but alcohol causes a wide range of cancers, no doubt about it. Okay, in terms of who is exposed and is the exposure well controlled, here is where I want to bring you some of the results from the studies that I've been recently involved in with particularly Lynn Fritchie, Renee Carey, both from Curtin, and Han Nguyen from the Centre for Work Health and Safety in New South Wales, and Camille Abdullah, who is the research officer for some of the work. So what I'm going to show to you first is information from an online exposure survey across Australia. In terms of the participants, there are about 600 or so, and I don't want to go into the detail because we don't have time, but just to give you a bit of a feel, this is the age distribution of the people involved, showing you that most of them were middle-aged. 55 plus seems almost young to me nowadays. In terms of the industry, about half were from the manufacturing industry. What the survey showed is of the people who were exposed to welding fume, the majority, the big majority, seem to be exposed at high levels. Now, bear in mind, this is a survey, so it's not actually the measurements. We're basing our assessment on what the people said that they did and what control measures they said that they had. So most were exposed at what we would say is a high level. This is showing the constituents that people were working with, and most were exposed to chromium-6, as you would know is a nasty metal to be exposed to, or you might not know, but it is a nasty metal to be exposed to. In terms of ultraviolet radiation, about 8% or so seem to have non-trivial exposure, and most of that 8% were exposed at a high level. that the exposure at any level was more common in the very small workplaces and in places where the workers didn't have formal qualifications in welding. In terms of the use of control measures, again, this is based on self-report. Nearly everybody wore some sort of protective clothing, and most of that was welding goggles or a shield. Only just under 20% said that there was ventilation in the workplaces. And where there wasn't ventilation in the workplace, about 40% or so had an air-supplied welding helmet. Worryingly, 50% of the people who responded said there was neither ventilation nor an air-supplied helmet there. And in some information I'm going to show you later on, where we actually went into the workplaces, there's a considerable proportion of people where there wasn't good ventilation, and people weren't using not only just a PAPA, they weren't using any sort of respiratory protection at all. In terms of the use of control measures, other things apart from the ones I just mentioned, 60% had some sort of warning signs around their welding area, or reported that they did. About the same proportion said they regularly maintained the equipment. About half had some sort of isolation between the welding area and the rest of the workplace. And given the 5 different workplace safety measures that people could report on, this is separate to the straight control measures, but the other things like signs or divisions from where the work was being done, most workplaces had about 2 of those safety measures in place. So what I've just shown you is just a very brief run through from the survey. Now I want to show you the results from, the survey of people. Now I want to show you the results of the survey of the workplaces, where we actually got the measurements of exposure to welding fume. And again, I won't go into great detail about it, but I just want to show you the methods so that you had a feel for what we did. So we had a sample of 20 workplaces. All of these were in New South Wales. Maybe 2/3 were in the metropolitan or around the metropolitan region. The other third were more in the country. So we had the convenient sample of 20 workplaces, and we took personal samples from the breathing zone of 67 welders. And what that arrow is pointing to is a sampler we've got attached to somebody. So we're collecting their welding fume levels from that. So we got those from 67 welders. We also took static samples. So these were a similar sort of thing, but just attached to somewhere around the workplace. And we did about 4 in each workplace. And in addition to that, we had measurements using a personal real-time monitor for ozone. So we only had the one instrument, and so we're collecting 1 welder at each work site. And a few work sites we couldn't do it for a range of reasons. And we also had a look around the workplace itself to look at what controls were in place, what the welders were doing. And I won't go into great detail, but I'm going to give you the main results from it. This is to show you what we were collecting. So where that person had something just on their neck, we were collecting from the breathing zone. This is what happened by the end of the shift. So normally that disc is white, and this brown part in the middle is what we collected. So show you again, down the bottom is a disc from the sampler at the end of the shift, and the white above is what it looks like before. That's the blank. That's what it should look like if you weren't breathing that other stuff in. So here are the results of welding fume particulate. Along the bottom, you're seeing the results from the 67 workers. On the y-axis is the level of exposure in milligrams per meter cubed. Now the red line is what the exposure standard was while we were doing the study. So that was 5 milligrams per meter cubed. The yellow line is what the exposure standard is now, because that changed a bit over a year ago. So it's now 1. So if you look at the red line, there were 3 people who were above the exposure standard when we were doing it. And the vast majority, you can see, were above the new exposure standard. This is showing similar things, but it's showing it for ozone. So on each of these columns is a result from 1 worker. The yellow dotted line is the peak limitation standard. So the previous one was a time-weighted average standard over an 8-hour shift. This one is the peak, so people should never go above this. And this is showing the peak levels for each of the workers. This is and the y-axis is parts per million. So what that's indicating is that nearly all the workers are going above the peak limitation standard at some stage. And when it was happening was when they were leaning over the work, a bit like you can see in this photo, but even a little bit more. When worker would lean over it, the peak exposure standard was being exceeded nearly all the time. As soon as the worker went back, the levels would drop. In terms of the control measures, and you might notice here's the 3rd time that shirt has appeared in this presentation. I do have another shirt, by the way, it's just coincidence from the other 2 photos, and I thought I'd wear it today just to match. There wasn't a lot of use of active ventilation. The arrow there's pointing to some local exhaust ventilation. What we commonly saw was these pedestal fans, which were being used to blow the fume from the work area where the welding was being done. But the problem with that is that what that's doing is blowing the fume just into the general work area rather than exhausting it. And so when there are workers in that general work area, they're still being exposed to lower levels than the welder would be exposed, but still being exposed. And those people are very unlikely to be using any respiratory protection. About half of the welders, at least at some stage, were using powered air purifying respirators, like the one that I've got on here in this photo. But worryingly, about a 5th of people had no respiratory protection at all. And just bear in mind, we're dealing with a known lung carcinogen. So the implications of those results to us and to me are that most welders are being exposed potentially to high levels. So not all of them are going to be exposed to that level if they're wearing appropriate protection, but if they're not wearing appropriate protection, those levels are high. The use of ventilation is limited, and that's a real problem because that should be a mainstay in terms of one of the control measures in place. But even if ventilation is in place, the use of appropriate respiratory protection was limited. And you know that respiratory protection, any sort of PPE, shouldn't be the first thing that we go to in the workplace. But in something like this, where you've got a respiratory carcinogen, everybody should be wearing it regardless of the other control measures in place. And that's definitely not the case at the moment. So there's a lot of scope for improvement. I want to talk a little bit now about exposure and risk. Keep in mind that risk is the probability that something will occur. It doesn't mean it will occur, it's giving you some indication of the likelihood of it occurring. Anytime you have exposure to a hazardous substance, you will have some risk. We all have that in our everyday life. And the only way to have no risk at all is to have no exposure at all. It's important to keep in mind that the higher the exposure, the higher the risk. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the lower the exposure, the lower the risk. So anything you can do to lower your exposure, or that we can do to lower our exposure, that will be helping to lower the risk. So we don't want to just do one thing, we want to do whatever we can within reason. I'm not being ridiculous about it, but essentially we want to, in an ideal world, we'd have no exposure at all. We can't probably We probably can't avoid exposure altogether, but we want the exposure to be as low as possible. It's also worthwhile keeping in mind that risk is related to cumulative exposure. So it increases with longer term or repeated, especially if it's repeated high level exposure. And it's affected by a whole lot of factors. And I'm not going to go through the detail of this, and a lot of you would know this very well, of course. But there's a whole series of things that can make exposure more likely or more likely at a higher level. And all of those we should try to address if we can. So in terms of controlling the exposure and limiting the risk of cancer, we should always go to the hierarchy of control. And I presume most of you would know this, so I don't want to go into great detail about it, but just to remember, the reason it's called a hierarchy is we should start at the top and work our way down. So we shouldn't ever go directly to personal protective equipment. Now, with welding, it's hard to find something to eliminate unless you're not going to weld, and that's possible in some areas. But presumably, if you're going to weld, there are different techniques that can be used that create more fume or more hazardous types of fume. Different materials that can be used, or things that you can do to the material to try and decrease the amount of fume coming from it or the amount of UV light coming from it. In terms of isolating, it's important as much as possible to separate the area where welding is from other work areas. And as seen in this photo, there are what's commonly used in the workplace are these sort of curtain arrangements. They're certainly good for decreasing direct exposure to the UV light if you're behind the curtain. Some separation of welding fume too, but it doesn't completely stop the welding fume getting past, of course, because it just can go above the curtains or around the curtains. Ventilation is very important. You can have extraction on the tools, as shown figuratively here. And you can use ventilation. And my big lesson, or two big lessons, I think, one of them from our looking at the workplaces was that there's a lot of scope for improvement in terms of ventilation. Most of the places we went into, there was no active ventilation at all. It was just that they were big open areas, and it was just that general ventilation they're relying on, which most of the time I would say is not good enough. In terms of administrative controls, there's a whole range of things that can be done. I've mentioned a few here in terms of making sure people have appropriate education and training, trying to keep people who aren't welding away from the welding areas, have appropriate signage. And also exposure standards are important, of course, and one big improvement has been the dropping of the exposure standard from 5 to 1, which I think is important, but it's worthwhile keeping in mind that the exposure standards are only as good as their use and their enforcement, and that we shouldn't be saying, well, above 1 is unsafe and below 1 is safe. That's not the case. We should always be trying to decrease the exposures as low as we can. Personal protective equipment, now the shirt's back. Just keep in mind that it should be the last option, but in welding, I would still say it's essential. We should, people who are involved in welding should always have some sort of effective respiratory protective equipment, and ideally it should be a PAP or a powered air supplied respirator. Otherwise, we need a half-face respirator that's properly fitted and checked. It's also important to make sure that any filters that are used cover the particulates, but also ozone. Ozone is not from a cancer point of view, but it's still an important exposure. And if it's just a particulate filter, it won't deal with ozone.
Tim, just on, oh, sorry, whilst you're on PPE, I thought I'd just jump in with a couple of questions because they relate specifically to it. And I think you've already answered one, but just for clarity's sake, One of them was, what about the 3M gas masks with Weld filters? So the reusable welding respirator, do these help any?
I'm not sure is the honest answer.
Right.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure. Don't take my word for it. The key is that whatever whatever filter you have, it needs to be appropriate for the exposure you've got. So we're doing with welding particulate. So you need an appropriate particulate filter, but you need something that deals with the gases as well. And the reason that and I'm sure most others would say a powered air supply respirator is really what is needed is because you no longer require to have it fitted and to check the fitting. It's just much, much more reliable and also much more comfortable than wearing a half-face respirator. Matt, you said you had another question?
Just one more. A quick one. Do safety glasses protect eyes from UV?
Not if they're clear glass, no. You need to have needs to be appropriately tinted. But safety glasses on their own, no.
Excellent. That's it for PPE. I'll let you get on with the rest.
Just about finished, I think.
No worries.
Yeah, I mentioned the need for fit testing is very important and that people know how to use it. So to be appropriately trained to use the respirators they've got. The fit testing for the half face. You don't need the fit testing for the PAPRs. And it's just important to keep in mind, these are not something you can chuck on the floor. You've got to have them appropriately stored and cleaned and maintained. And also, it's important that air monitoring be done so that it's known what the levels of exposure are, and because that can indicate whether the exposure controls are effective or not. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention is I presume most of you who are in attendance today are here because you're interested in your own health and the health of the people you work with. It's worthwhile keeping in mind that there are a lot of common exposures that we all have that where it's very clear that they increase the risk of cancer, or if they're well controlled or used, they can decrease the risk of cancer. And so there are a whole suite of things that you can do in your own life to decrease your own risk of cancer. I'm not saying this in any way to detract from the importance of controlling exposure to welding fume and UV light, but just something else for you to think about. So these are, don't smoke, decrease the amount of alcohol that you take, exercise regularly, eat well, try and maintain an appropriate weight, and restrict your own exposure to solar UV. They're all areas that we can take on in our own lives that will help decrease the risk of cancer. But just to emphasize, I'm not saying that to minimize the importance of properly controlling, decreasing exposure to welding fume and UV light from welding. So to come back to my key points, what are the exposures of concern? Welding fume and UV radiation. Do they cause cancer? They definitely do. Who's exposed? A lot of people. I don't think exposure is well controlled at the moment. I certainly think there's plenty of room for improvement. Keep in mind that the lower the exposure, the lower the risk. So whatever you can do to lower your exposure, you'll be helping to lower your risk. And in terms of thinking, well, how can that be done? Is to always go back to the hierarchy of control. That's it for me, Matt. And I'd be very happy to take any questions or have comments from people.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. That was really insightful. We've got a good, 15 or so minutes for some questions. So please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that you have. We do have a few to start us off. So Well, there's two about exposure risk. So one's more broad, one's more specific. So broadly, does the type of metal affect exposure risk? And then if we were to go a little bit more specifically, is the fume from the heating of the metal being welded or the type of welding electrode, TIG rod, or MIG wire um, more or less risky?
Okay. The first thing I'll say before I answer any of those questions is I am not a welder. So if I say anything that you think that guy's got no idea what he's talking about, please jump in. So just bear that in mind. But notwithstanding that, I think what I'm going to be saying to you is true. Matt, the first one was, does the type of metal
Affect exposure risk.
um, it's probably better to say the type, certain metals carry more of a problem
Yeah,
rather than more likely to generate fume. I'm actually unsure whether uh, you get different fume from different metal in terms of the absolute quantity of it. Probably is
right,
a little bit different, but I don't recall reading that that in itself is the major issue. It's more the content,
right.
you know, the type of metal. And I mentioned chromium 6 was a common exposure, and that's certainly a nasty metal to be exposed to. Chromium 6 is a known cause of lung cancer and just generally is a nasty metal to be exposed to. Um, zinc is not fantastic either, but chromium 6 is a main one I'd be worried about in that situation. The second one was the type of welding technique, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
So is it the metal being welded or is it the type of welding, the electrode? Yeah, the type of equipment, the TIG rod
yeah.
or the MIG
So
wire.
the type of equipment, the flux that you use, the intensity that's being used with the electrode, uh, and uh, the broader type of welding, they can all influence fume. Another thing that I didn't mention explicitly is the coatings that are often on the metals. And it's good if you can to take those coatings off before the welding's being done, because sometimes there are nasty things coating.
Excellent. Thanks for those questions. We've got a few more. So let's have a look. Well, what organizations do I need to seek out to get environmental monitoring carried out or air monitoring?
And so you need an occupational hygienist. Uh, and there's a wide range of those. I'm not a hygienist, but I've worked with them on this study clearly. Uh, there's none I specifically recommend, not because I don't think they're good, just uh, there's just so many around that it wouldn't be hard to find people to do it. But you need a hygienist, basically.
And so, following your research, so do you think awareness of welding related health risks is high among welders themselves?
I don't think it's great based on my experience in the workplace. Um, I, uh, During the study that we were doing, I would say most welders weren't aware of the connection with lung cancer. Uh, Most welders, I think, were more concerned with the short-term effects like metal fume fever or welding arc. But because people are because flash burns are so well known to people, they always, essentially always will wear a visor with some sort of tinting on it because the effect is clear in the short term. The problem with something like lung cancer is just it's insidious. You weld for you weld for 20 years and have no problem, and so assume that it's no problem. But because of the long latency, the period between when people are exposed and when they get the illness from it, it's hard to appreciate the risk. Now, I should emphasize that it's still only a small proportion of welders, fortunately, who get lung cancer. So I don't want people going home thinking, oh, I've been welding, therefore I'm going to get lung cancer. That's not the point of today. The point of today is just to take it, is not just, but is to take it seriously.
Mm.
The welding fume exposure and the exposure to the UV radiation, they're not trivial things. And whatever you can do, and if you're employed by somebody, whatever your employer should be doing or can do, they should be doing to minimize your exposure. And if that's happening, great. But if it's not happening, it's important to get some activity in place so it does happen.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Um, do you know if there are any records of how many people have died from or who have been diagnosed with cancer from welding, either directly or indirectly?
Okay, there are no direct records, definitely. And it's almost impossible for those to be in place because there's no way of telling in an individual with lung cancer what the cause of that lung cancer was. So, for example, let's say I was a smoker and I'd been a smoker for 30 years and I developed lung cancer when I was 70. The likelihood is that that lung cancer had come from my smoking, but it might not have. And there's no good way to tell that. There's been some advances in recent years looking at the genetic changes in the cancers to give an indication, but there's still no way of telling for sure. So you can't just go around counting them. There are plenty of studies that have been done looking at how to estimate the numbers, and there's good methodology to allow that, and I've been involved in some of that. So there certainly can be estimates of the numbers of people involved who've been affected, but you have to keep in mind that they are only estimates.
Hmm.
Sorry, that just to add to that, that because of that, and because the connection between exposure and cancer is clear, I think the most important thing that we can do is to monitor the exposures
Hmm.
and not to monitor the exposures and do nothing about them, but monitor the exposures, and where they're well controlled, great, but where they're not well controlled, do something to get them well controlled. Rather than, I'm very keen, given that my background is epidemiology, to know the numbers and rates of cancers, for example, because they can be good motivators for change. But we don't want to wait around for 20 or 30 years for those cases to occur.
Hmm.
So if we can keep a strong eye on the exposures and do something about exposures where they're high, I think that's the best thing for us to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on measuring exposures, one of the questions is, does each state have requirements as to maximum fume exposure allowable in a work setting, and when airflow, respiration, filter equipment must be worn?
Well, the national standard exposure standard I mentioned, 1 milligram per meter cubed, they get picked up by each of the state and territories' OHS legislation. So in what that level is and the enforcement of it is at state and territory level. As
Hmm.
far as I'm aware, all the states and territories pick up in their legislation the national levels, so that 1 milligram per meter cubed is the level in all states and territories as far as I'm aware. Again, as far as I'm aware, there's no specific requirement about how an employer meets their obligations to make sure that people have as low exposure as possible. And that's reasonable. People can use whatever approach that they need to within reason. But it's also worthwhile keeping in mind what I said before, that 1 milligram per meter cubed, that's not a dividing line between safe and unsafe. And especially with a carcinogen where risk is directly related to cumulative exposure, one should be doing whatever can reasonably be done to lower exposure, to get exposure as low as possible. So all the control measures that I mentioned before ought to be in place, regardless of what almost regardless of what the exposure level is.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I think that answers
one,
the question. Is that right? Did that
yeah,
address the question? I think.
absolutely. I think so. So do you believe Australia's current regulatory and legislative framework is adequate? And is this primarily an enforcement issue? Alternatively, are there legislative measures that could be implemented to better address exposure and risk management?
That's a big question. Could
It
get
is.
me into trouble with what I say. Uh, Look, my feeling is that the regulatory framework is okay, and the problem is with the enforcement.
Mm,
Not everybody would agree with that, but uh, and also it's impossible for us as a community to have enough enforcement to be able to absolutely ensure every workplace is safe. There has to be a requirement and an understanding that it's up to each and every workplace, and also bearing in mind that a lot of people who do welding are self-employed, so can't just rely on another person to have this in place. But where there is an employer-employee arrangement, there's no doubt it's the employer's responsibility. And if one's self-employed, it's one's responsibility to look after oneself. But it shouldn't be a case of, well, we'll do whatever we like unless we get inspected or until we get inspected. Everybody should be taking, the employers should be taking it on themselves and are legally required to take it on themselves to have exposures as low as reasonably practicable. And in some situations, I don't think it is the case with that it's in legislation with welding, but in terms of what is actually required, what to get exposures as low as reasonably practical, what is required is that people have appropriate ventilation in place and respiratory protection in place as an absolute minimum.
Thanks, Tim. Uh, are there any procedures that should be in place in terms of washing your clothing? Should it be separate from standard clothing? For instance, which is, yeah, following on from like what you would do for asbestos exposure or silica dust,
Yeah,
right?
there isn't an equivalent. The exposure of concern is respiratory, and fume is different to the dust that you would have, for example, with asbestos, with asbestos fibers. I mean, there is solid particulate, and just as a matter of course, it a good practice, I would say people shouldn't be wearing home the clothing that they're wearing when they're doing their welding, unless they're wearing it underneath some sort of overalls or other protective equipment.
Mm,
But it's not the same concept of exposure from dust that you might take home and expose somebody else from the dust from welding. Because the issue really is the fume getting into the lung.
right. So I think we've got time for, we'll do one more question before we go on to close the webinar. So when the workplace exposure limits are introduced after 1st of December next year, do you envisage there will be accompanying regulations to measure the pollutants in workshop air, or that exposed workers will require lung testing?
This is welders we're talking about.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm going to assume we'll apply
yeah,
this to welders for today.
yeah. The first part, I don't know. I'd be surprised because I think there's already a requirement
Mm,
for employers, the people in charge of the workplace, to know what the level of exposure is. And if they can demonstrate that it's low, then my understanding is they don't need to measure it. But
yeah,
if they're not sure or they think it's high, there is a requirement to know that, to put in place appropriate control measures. And I think prudently I actually don't know if it's legal or not, but prudently to then measure it to make sure that the levels have
yeah.
come down. The second part was about respiratory function testing or the equivalent of that. I'm not aware that there's a good case to do respiratory function testing in welders on an ongoing basis, different to silica exposure. That's required legally. It's not for welders, and I think probably there isn't good enough evidence to require it at the moment. I mentioned earlier on there's some evidence of welding causing chronic lung disease, welding fume exposure causing chronic lung disease, but it's a little bit equivocal, the information. So you may well not be gaining much by having that. Now, that advice might change in the years to come, but I'm pretty sure that's correct for the current situation. And certainly, sorry to interrupt, Matt, certainly there's no case for doing regular chest x-rays, for example. You probably know about the lung cancer screening that started in Australia. And at the moment, that's not for occupational exposures. That's for people who've smoked above a certain level for a certain period of time. I envisage that will be modified at some stage to include some occupational exposures based on risk. And there might come a time where welding exposure is included in that. But I would hope that wouldn't be required because the control of the exposures would be low enough that the risk wouldn't be high enough to justify it.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tim. Whilst I just share my screen, quick question. Are you aware of any handheld devices in the marketplace for measuring fume levels?
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not. Doesn't mean they don't exist. As I said, I'm not a hygienist, but certainly there was no discussion of us having access to something like that when we were doing the study. Not impossible, I guess, but you need to have them in the breathing zone of the worker. So you've got to be able to have something like that ozone monitor I was showing you a photo of. And yeah, I'm not aware of, at the moment, at least, of them being available. It's possible they are, but they're certainly not in routine practice.
Excellent. No, thanks so much for that, Tim. There's a few other questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, but I'll do my best to go through them out of session, and then we'll find a way to contact you, and we'll be in touch with hopefully some helpful answers for you. So thanks very much to Tim for that insightful presentation, and to all of you for the great questions and discussion. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to briefly highlight the welding awareness campaign that sits behind today's webinar. So this national campaign was launched on the 1st of August to coincide with Tradies National Health Month, and it's supported by a grant from the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists Foundation. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to the AIOH Foundation. So the aim of the campaign is simple. It's simple but important. It's to raise awareness of the cancer risks from welding, and then to promote the use of effective control measures to reduce exposure and keep workers safe. So we're targeting a wide audience, not only welders themselves, but also supervisors and managers, work health and safety professionals, unions, and other industry stakeholders. So key features include the webinar, a suite of social media posts running throughout August, and a 90-second animated explainer video, which we'll show you in just a moment. So by attending today's webinar, you've already shown your support for the campaign, so thank you very much. There are two other simple ways you can help spread the word. So firstly, by sharing the welding webpage or the video with your colleagues and networks. And then secondly, by liking and engaging with any of the campaign posts you come across on Cancer Council Australia's Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. To close, we'll now play the 90-second animated video, which neatly sums up the campaign's core messages, and we think is a great resource to share with others.
Your workplace health and safety is important. When welding, you may be exposed to cancer-causing agents like ultraviolet radiation and welding fume, a mixture of gases and dust in the air. Some welding fumes are easy to see, but many are invisible. Breathing in welding fumes can cause lung cancer. UV radiation is produced by the arc or laser. and can be reflected off hard and smooth surfaces around the welder. Being exposed to this radiation can damage the eyes and lead to eye melanoma. If you're welding, especially in confined or restricted spaces, then you're at risk. Other workers nearby can be exposed too. Not all exposed workers will develop cancer. The higher your exposure, the higher your risk. You can reduce your risk by lowering exposure, using good work health and safety controls that your employer and you can put in place. Separate welding activities from other work jobs. Use on-tool extraction and mechanical ventilation. Choose welding techniques and consumables that produce less fume or UV. Remove paint or coatings before welding. Provide appropriate training for workers. Wear a full face helmet with a UV filtered lens. And always use appropriate respiratory protection, preferably an air-supplied helmet. Reduce workplace exposure from welding. For more information, visit the Cancer Council website.